Oh, right. That monument there. Oh, okay. That sounds really, but you're right.
All right. Ready to deal with the rowdies? Oh, well, that's okay. So, and I have Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Iowa Files. We have to thank our members and donors, the West Des Moines Public Library, the Friends Foundation of the West Des Moines Library, and Bravo Greater Des Moines for the funding that makes this series possible. So if you're a donor, thank you very much. If you're not, come see me at the end of the program, and I'll convince you that supporting your local historical society is well worth the time, well worth the investment. Gayla did not want much of an intro, so I think I'm really excited to learn more about Iowa's poor farms. It's a subject that I know nothing about, so I hope you are all as ignorant as I am. You know what I mean. So thank you so much for coming today.
Gail, is it all right if I move the computer?
Oh, gosh, yes.
That way it helps me, since that's behind me, helps keep me on track. See my amazing tech skills at work. Oh.
Watch out for the dongles.
Yeah. Got it. Okay. I am delighted to have been asked to come and speak with you about something that's always been near and dear to my heart, and that's a bit of the history of poor farms, county care facilities, et cetera, and how they progressed. And the first thing I want to do, though, is ask people in the audience, is there a specific reason that you're here, that what you wanted to hear, or what your experience is? I just got to talk to somebody who has some amazing stories that she could probably share up here with me that would be just as, useful as mine. Yeah.
Well, my ex-husband just broke down with the mental thing, and so first went to this hospital, finally they sent him to Broadlands because he was going to be sick longer than they figured. And I go visit him, and it just made me sick to walk on those floors in there. The people were just, and they looked very poor. I mean, they weren't in a hospital clothes or anything. And I think that's where the poor were treated in those days.
We've really made quite a journey.
Yeah, and I know, I'm a nurse, and I worked mental health for 4 years. And some of these people I found out their stories later, they do something to get arrested, so they have a place to, nice woman,
A definite break in our system causes people to be in a variety of places. Well, good. That's really interesting. So you have some firsthand experience with what that was like. Anybody else? Yes.
I come from a little bit different perspective. my parents actually were, they called it back in that time, a steward and a matron of the Hamilton County Home. And so from the time I was 5 days old until I was 16, I actually lived at Ford Farm. And it was wonderful. I mean, I had a lot of, they thought I was their little sister. You know, I was a baby and they all like that. And then I grew up and I told her I didn't have to make my bed until I was 16. So it was just, it was, you know, and my parents did a really good job. We had a lot of good community involvement. People came out to visit and did activities with them and things like that. We had a farm, and so there were dairy cows and pigs and chickens and so, yeah. And I have 2 older brothers, so they were young, we all worked there, you know, so we were a family there.
And that's your story. It's going to be a whole lot bigger than before.
It goes all over the map. There were good ones that were ran very, very well, and others that weren't. But I can tell you in my history of 30 years working with county care facilities, et cetera, I didn't know anybody who got into the business to be abusive or to wreck somebody's day or to be in control of somebody. But there were definitely some that were substandard. So you're spot on with your observation, and she is too, because it really kind of, you could find a variety.
My Bluebird troop here in Des Moines used to go to Polk County home and play board games and talk to people.
Absolutely, there were church groups and things like that that would come out. So I'm just interested to see what experiences maybe and kind of, you know, what tweaked your interest here. So with that, I was looking, Gail assured me that this could be a very informal gathering. And so if you have questions, I encourage you to stop me and ask. I went back kind of looking through things for information about Poor Farms that I might want to share with you, and saw that there had been somebody who did a presentation along quite a while back, but it was very academic on Poor Farms and things like that. My presentation is going to be a little more geared, there's, you know, historical data, but also personal experience things that I'm going to throw in. So I'm excited to get started and visiting with you. Now I've got to make sure I've got this going the right way. There, up, down, you told me that. So kind of what I just got into is I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and what my perspective is. My last job, I've been working as a consultant for a number of years, was working on home and community-based services, application and implementation with the National Disability Institute out of Washington. And I just left my job and actually fully retired June 30th. So it's been an interesting journey to kind of move away from that. Prior to that, I was a technical assistance liaison between Iowa Medicaid that has the responsibility of overseeing and implementing the rules for care facilities and other facilities and services that impact persons with disabilities' lives. And I worked out of the Iowa Provider Association. So we did a lot of work back and forth, but that also kept me in some of the county care facility settings, which when I started were you know, a large group, because every county here in Iowa had one. So at one point there's 99, but that's kind of where that went. And then this is the Story County Care Facility perspective. And I was telling somebody, she asked me, you know, how I got into this, and in 1978, I had graduated from Iowa State with a degree in English education, secondary, and psychology. I took these psychology courses because I kept my grade point up and I just thought it was, just really fun, but you couldn't get a job with that. And then I had an experience in the classroom. And I found out the students weren't exactly as I had envisioned them to be, not quite as interested in literature as I'd hoped. And the environment was like, this is not, it just wasn't what I expected. So I picked up my resume and thought, well, maybe I have to do something else, and started in on the psychology, trying to use that as my in. And there was an ad at the Story County Care Facility for a program director, activity coordinator. And so I responded to that, and that's where I found my people, my niche. I started there in '78, and I loved it. It was the most incredible opening of a door for my career, my journey in the workforce. So I worked there as their program director, and then I worked for a year as the assistant director, and then I was the executive director of the care facility from 1982 to 1988. And in 1988, our care facility closed. We tore down the building and everything, and we moved everybody into the community, into individual apartments and a couple of small group homes and things. So, and I left that job in 2012. So I'm privileged to have gotten to see this entire history, I think, unfold. So I hope what I'm going to share with you is going to be interesting. Oh, I went the wrong way again. So Iowa Poor Farms County Care Facilities, what we're going to talk about today is what role did the Poor Farm Care Facility play, who lived there, what their daily life was like. You could probably pitch in at any point. I would welcome any input that you'd like to share. The impact on institutions, things that changed how they functioned, funding and rules, the gradual shift in purpose, and what's become of the county home. When Gail contacted me, she said people were interested in knowing what happened to them. So we'll talk about that too. So the history, the basic line of the history is that caring for citizens who were destitute, didn't have a way to take care of themselves for one reason or another, that responsibility fell to local government. It was not mandated that it fell to local government until a little bit later. But each county would have to, they came up with how to fund their setting for persons who were less fortunate, and how much their budget would be, what the requirements were to be there, etc. So they started out that way. And then that was in the 1800s, and they really started to shift during Social Security. But still, the responsibilities fell to local governments, although they were more regulated at that time. So counties have often always been part of that support. So can I take this out? Okay, cool. Got it. So social support is not unique to Iowa, and it's been known by many names, and I just listed a few here. But almost every state had a system of taking care of those persons who could not take care of themselves in their communities. And they were largely focused, especially here in Iowa, on their community, their county's citizens. They didn't worry about what was happening in Story County if you were from Boone County, et cetera. It was very insular as far as their responsibilities and who they took. And that also changed over time, where there'd be a variety of counties represented and people came from all over. But this is kind of the history of what they've been known as. And here's a picture of the Bramer County Care Facility and their poorhouse. And back when facilities first started, the majority of them were built as wood structures, smaller structures on some county ground. The counties all had farmland. And so that's where people would set these facilities. And the people lived there, and at that time, farming was not associated at all with the poorhouse, which is what they called it then. And just people could be there for short or longer term support. It just depended on what people needed. What really started to change things in Iowa, and I alluded to this earlier, was the passage of the Iowa Poor Law, 1842. And that led to a more organized system of county homes and rules around how counties needed to fund them, et cetera. And it specifically identified persons with mental illness, intellectual disabilities who didn't have family support. Because if you did have family support, it was expected really that your families would take care of you and you would not be living in this setting. So it was right then, I think, when I look back at all the different legislation and things that started to change for people who had a disability, this to me really is the hallmark, because it was the first time I think that we've recognized that persons with disabilities of whatever sort need support and deserve support. So I put the link down there, but this rule covered things like guardians, payment of costs, inventory of people's property, collecting data to a limited extent, court commitments, deaths, all that. This was all covered within that, so it was really very interesting. So, as I said, counties had farmland, and so that's where they built. And the counties themselves were very, very dependent on county citizen input on what should be done, because those citizens worked with the boards of supervisors then at that time to suggest a budget and what the things needed, what it needed to look like and what they were hoping to have. And there came to be somewhat of a competition between counties on what are you going to do for those people? You know, where are you going to be? And a little bit of a competition, but it certainly was not the Taj Mahals that we were talking about. So as I said, many of them started as larger wooden houses, and with wooden houses come more construction breakdown, etc. But the biggest deal was they burned, and that caused a change in thought of where we started to look at brick institutions being built, and also the need became far much larger than what they ever thought it was going to be. So we went there from there to these bigger brick type facilities that you're seeing here. There's still quite a few of these out in our state. This thing that was kind of interesting to me about county care facilities is that they all basically, when they went to brick, looked pretty much the same. And they were built to be kind of a scaled down version of the mental institutions, because that's a picture of Cherokee Mental Health Hospital. And they were built on a Kirkbride construction architecture. And that had very specific things about them. Tall, sitting on preferably on a hill for elevated healing breezes. And that's because the windows at the top, typically, and in care facilities too, were made to be left open if you were treating people who had tuberculosis. So you wanted to be as high as possible to catch a good breeze, good therapeutic breeze. And so most of them are modeled after that, but not as grand as the mental health facilities. So caring for citizens who were destitute, as I said, fell to local government. And the category of destitute encompassed a variety of situations. Destitute included people who'd fallen on hard times. And I don't know if your family ever said, if we don't knock it off, we're going to end up in the poor farm. statements like that, or, you know, don't send me out there. I gotta have, you know, I gotta have a place to go when I'm ready to retire. I don't want to go to the poor farm, that kind of stuff. And persons who were elderly and didn't have people to help take care of them. Persons who were able-bodied but didn't have a means of personal support. In other words, something interfered with them being able to be gainfully employed. Their physical, developmental, and mentally ill persons served, and widows. So people come in if they've been widowed and there's no means of support for them with children. And as attested to here by one of our persons in attendance, children were able to be in those facilities way back. And unwed mothers, it was often a place that people went if you were an unwed mother. Orphans, again, children. And then there's a really interesting category of other. Oh, I think I passed it. No, goodness sakes. I apologize here. I just skipped. Oh, I did. Okay, there we go. There we go. My apology. So others included a wide variety of people, and this is where I'm going to give you some of the anecdotal experiences that I had. And I started, as you saw, late 70s, 78, in there, and it was very common that the other category would include people that John Stark, the Story County Sheriff at that time, became a good friend, would drive up, have one of his patrol guys come up with a sheriff's car and say, I got one for you, Gay. And it would be somebody who maybe had committed some sort of a minor offense, et cetera, was wandering around, seemed to be drunk, disorderly, whatever. And they were dropped off for us to care for on kind of an interim basis. Sometimes the interim turned into full-time basis. But, and at that time, the concept of due process was flexible. We'll say that. So that was really interesting. Quite an eye-opener for me too when that happened. So also when people came in, it just in general, even back with the people who were considered to be destitute and others, we had these giant ledger books. I don't know if you've ever seen any of these. Historical societies often have some. The county auditor's office often has some. And, but we would record the data that they wanted to be collected was condition upon admission. And it'd say something like insane, pregnant, poor, et cetera, and their names would be written and entered in, and everybody in the county knew who those people were because privacy around like HIPAA laws, et cetera, did not exist then. And so there'd be, at one time, those persons' names published in the paper, so there was no, anonymity to that at all. I thought that was very interesting, but the notes of the ledger were public knowledge. Okay. Oh, boy, howdy. So who lived there at the care facility? And what's your name?
Mary Ann.
As Mary Ann explained, there was a superintendent and a matron often, or they were called administrators, but they typically lived on site, including living directly in the facility. And that was expected. The job was absolutely 24/7. And the people's families incorporated in with the family unit that the care facilities provided. Almost everybody in the family worked in the facility in some way or another, et cetera. So they employed family members, and it was often passed from one parent, or, to their son's daughters. I personally knew in Plymouth County a family that had had 3 generations of the same family leadership in those settings. So it was very much a kind of a homespun thing. And at this time, these people were responsible for implementing the rules for residents. And it wasn't until into the 80s, 70s, 80s, where there really became formalized rules that were taken care of by the state, et cetera. Up to this point, it was pretty much what the administrators, et cetera, thought they needed to do to run the facility well, which speaks to the experience that you had, where you came into a horrible situation compared to Mary Ann, where it's like, that was home. This was nice, because it was left up to the persons running it at that point. Wasn't until a little bit later that people had to ascribe to the rules. So care facilities provided housing, medical care, basic needs, spiritual needs, socialization, community, and I want to highlight that because it really was family, a family unit. Some of those people lived there for the majority of their life, and it was a very close-knit community. Other people were there and then left, et cetera, but there were cores of people who were there. And stability. The interesting thing about this is that all fell back to the counties because in the earlier times, before 1935, Social Security didn't exist. And so that was the linchpin that started changing. So you didn't see some of the same people show up because there actually was a system of support for them. Oh, sure.
If a person were to show up at one of these homes, and there's probably several people, thank you. If a person were to show up at one of these homes and the home was full, so then would that person then be told, oh, we're gonna take you over to this other county, or?
That didn't happen until quite a lot later, when there were more social services rules, et cetera, on how you make referrals, et cetera. Those persons, I suppose there was always the county general relief department, and they were mostly the referral source for county care facilities in the day. I would imagine that what would have happened is that they would have tried to make the best with a family or something until something else could come up. But families could come, and they did, and say, my daughter needs help, do you have a spot? And that could be honored then. And again, that's prior to when some of the more restrictive rules came about. Okay. Self-sustainability. One of the things that I thought was super cool about the care facility is that essentially it was self-sufficient. We had, where I was in Story County, 330 acres of the most lovely, tillable, farmable land. And we had a shared agreement for the farming where we shared costs and we shared expenses. And that was terrifying to me because I grew up in town. I asked them, so when you do the beans here, do you take them to the cannery in Ackley or Grimes? And it's like, okay, and so they stepped up the outside involvement to help make sure that that was managed, because obviously that was not my strong suit. But before I came, and Mary Ann said that this was still the case when she was there, animals, farm animals, crops, et cetera, were all processed there. I remember when I first started, people still did canning and some freezing of the vegetables out of the gardens. And they, produced their own meat, and the labor was supplied by persons who lived in the facility. That sort of started to change a bit because there were rules that came about that said that people had to be paid. a wage. And so when that came about, you didn't see as many people working in the crops and livestock. When they were using those folks primarily for that, there was a lot of complaint from the farmers who were managing it that they weren't the best help, and it was very difficult to supervise. So that was like, okay, we're not going to have them do that unless they're particularly skilled at it, and then they'd be employed in that. But largely, when people came into the facility, they were offered a job of kitchen help, janitorial, laundry, etc. And they were paid a commensurate wage with what the standard production would have looked like. So everybody who came in, it was assumed that you would work. And that was the assumption when I was there, too. It wasn't that you're coming in to just be, taken care of, et cetera. You need to do something. And I think, honestly, I continued my education in the disability field, and I have a degree in master's in psychiatric rehabilitation. And they will tell you that the number one thing that people need in order to stabilize, maintain, and keep good mental health is a job, because you're identified by what you do. I can say, hi, Marianne, what do you do? And if you didn't have a job or didn't have something to pull on in the past, you were essentially a resident, a person who needed to be taken care of. So kind of a fun story that I have is we had a gal, her name was Margene, and she worked in the laundry. And Margene she was very developmentally disabled. And she could fold approximately 10 towels a day, but she never missed a day at work. It was critical in her mind that she get there, and staff would help support her getting those out, and she got, a wage so that she could go, into town, et cetera, and or use the canteen. And when Margene passed away, her family asked if it would be okay with us if they stated in her obituary that she was employed by the Story County Care Facility, because that was her identity. And so I think that just kind of speaks to what that was like, and the important role that these places played for people to maintain, gain, stabilize mental health, and find a purpose. Okay, also who lived here, I think I kind of covered this a bit. They were persons who had mental illness or developmental disabilities as identified in the poor farm laws, and persons who were really seriously disabled. At one point, there was typically a separate facility on the grounds that would work as their asylum. And in Boone County, there was the brick facility, then there was this other wooden house that housed persons who were more challenging to have within the general population. And an interesting piece, if I brought it up here with me, and I might not have, but there was a fire that burned the asylum down in Boone County, and the reporting on it was phenomenally sensational, as I point down here. And they referred to people as insane, poor, unfortunates, etc. in the description in the newspaper. And it really kind of spoke to how people were regarded that had serious disability issues to contend with. It's like these poor unfortunates were burned to death. I mean, I urge you, if you want to take a look at that article, because the reporting is beyond the tabloid reporting on sensationalism. It was just crazy.
I'm just curious, Iowa at one time had 4 state mental health hospitals: Cherokee, Clarinda, Mount Pleasant, and Independence. Now we just have Independence and Cherokee. And you talk about, you're referencing this asylum that burned down and so forth. Did Iowa at that time have those parallel state institutions?
No, it was before they really came and were able to serve that function.
Okay.
So this was prior, 'cause like, this is 1894, and I think I have somewhere in my presentation of when the state institution started, yeah. There, I have it. So it was in, ta-da!
But they're actually prior to the date that you're looking at, 1894, the burning down did come well before that, except for Cherokee.
It did. So they must have had a parallel existence, an overlap at one point. But my experience with persons who had more significant needs for assistance often went to Glenwood and Woodward and then the Cherokee Mental Health Institutes. And the thing that was so nice about that is when those came on board, you could confer. You could actually have a collaborative approach. During my time, I could call up if somebody was really having a difficult time and ask the staff at Cherokee, could I send you Jim? Here's what's going on with him. We are not sure how to intervene. And it was at the same time that psychiatric medications were coming about, and they would work with the person, adjust their medications, help them get stabilized, and then have them come home. Same way worked with Woodward for us. We could send people back for a brief time, and they'd come back, and we worked back and forth. What changed that was managed care. That then it became starting to run things as a hospital or that type where you could go just quickly, and then you had only so much time before you'd be discharged. And that really changed that flavor. And I think that it's really, when I look back on things, one of the things that genuinely impacted who you could take, the kind of care you could give someone, because you didn't necessarily have a safety net. And I think that was one of the sad things in my book. And I think I talked about this a little earlier. My folks always said, we don't want to end up at the poor farm. We can't afford that. And there are families that did not want to admit that they had a family member there. Another personal story on that, when I started, I met a lady, her name is Mary, and she had the last name of my grandma's maiden name. And I remembered my mom saying something about Aunt Mary and what happened to her, because I knew what happened to my grandma's other brothers and sisters, etc. She said, I don't know. She wasn't right, so I just don't know. And then I started to work there, see this name, and I went back to my mom, because confidentiality was not an issue at that point, and I said, do you think Mary is Grandma Ruth's sister? And she said, did some looking around, talking to other people. I was like, yeah. So I found my great aunt there. None of us, my mom didn't know for sure where she was at or anything, because it was just shameful that you had to take advantage of the poor farm, the care facility, etc., or that somebody in your family had a disability that required them to have some other sort of assistance than what the family could give. So that was a eye-opener for me. And we also had one person that we had that was kind of like that, where we had to promise, write down never to take her into town, because her parents were very affluent in the Ames University community, and they wanted to make sure that nobody knew that their daughter was there. So, I mean, it's just sad, the stigma. And care facilities, poor farms were received as people who would be receiving substandard care. And then there was always the thing, most of those facilities had a horseshoe driveway. And we'd say, you come in the front, and then you go out the back, which is where the cemetery was located, on the property grounds. So you check in, but you can never leave. It was a true Hotel California.
Yeah.
Well, were there people that said that they wanted to leave, and if they wanted to, were they allowed to, or did you keep them hostage?
It depended. At the time that I was there, things started to change, and then you had to honor due process. So if a person had a court commitment, they had to stay. If they didn't, they could leave of their own free will anytime. So that was
Did you have people do that?
some. Most people, it really did become home. And they didn't really want to leave. There were people for sure who didn't feel comfortable and wanted out as soon as they could. So it kind of went the gamut. But I'll follow up a little bit on that, and so, because the question you asked impacted how facilities have changed, what's really happened in care facilities. Oop. So here we are. We're back full circle at the Poor Farm in their cemetery. And Story County had a cemetery like that. And remember the big ledger book that I mentioned? Condition upon admission, insane. Most of them said condition upon discharge, dead. You know, way to cut to the chase. And so many of the stones that we had at our cemetery, some were simply not marked with anything. They were just a small, like concrete homemade dot. And then there were a lot of them that had numbers, and we discovered that those numbers matched the ledger. So then you knew who was there. And so we did some work to try to reconstruct who was actually located there. And some people had, normal stones, et cetera. Some of the things they didn't tell me when I took the job at the care facility is I'm in charge of the cemetery. You want to talk about a resume builder? Being a cemetery manager is right up there. I got a call one day. How I found out I was part of the cemetery program. I got a call from General Relief, and they said, I have a family member here whose father died, and he needs to be buried in the cemetery there. And it's like, okay, good. And, then it was made clear to me that I needed to arrange that. And so remember, I was an English major. And so I'm thinking somebody's going to come out and dig the grave, and it's going to be a couple of guys. It's going to be misty, and they'll be there with shovels. It'll be very solemn. It was Secondary Roads that came out with a backhoe thing, and very unceremonious. And the problem was, because of the records that we had, it wasn't always clear which direction a person had been buried. So that was a challenge for sure. There was a lot of going down only so far and saying, nope, got to go somewhere else over there. But I think that's the case at a lot of them. When I left the care facility, when we closed, we deeded it back over to the Milford County Township. I'm sure they loved that. But it was their potato then. But people are still buried there. I find that really interesting. I mean, it was a quaint, lovely little cemetery, but I didn't realize it would still be in use, but as of at least a year ago.
Well, was it for just the people that had lived at the county home or Poor Farm or whatever it was called?
It was primarily built for those people, but it was also built for people who could not afford a funeral.
Oh, okay.
So if you couldn't afford to get a plot on your own, it came out of there. And I don't know if you're interested in this at all, but the thing that was really another eye-opener in how we regard people, et cetera, that when we'd have burials there, and they were pauper's burial is what they called them, the boxes that they used weren't really wooden. They were like this reinforced cardboard with flocking on them. And it was just like, it just, that's not right. Kind of a thing, but that's how that was. So.
Do you think they can do what it was called,
The vault?
the vault?
No. Later, we had vaults, but
So it was at a time that
Right, right. When it first started and was primarily populated, there weren't vaults. But going forward, like in my time, yes, we had to have a vault. So, yeah, just really interesting. I think you could do a whole series on those cemeteries and what they were like.
Is there a list that shows that? Because we didn't have one.
You didn't? Oh, that's interesting.
Not that I know.
You know, I came across when I was looking for dates and numbers and things for this, some history of pauper cemeteries online. So I wonder if that's where you could research some of that. Yeah,
Supposedly there was a spot way out in the fields, but nothing was out there that, we ever saw, so.
Mhm.
And I was 16 when my parents retired, so,
Right. Yeah. You weren't interested in going out and hanging out in the cemetery? Well, I can tell you that the Boone County Historical Society, I used to be the president of that organization for, about 10 years. And there was a resurging interest in Boone County's Poor Farm Cemetery, and a group of people who were working really hard to try to see, who was there, what were the circumstances that caused their death, and, how did they end up there. So I think that there's a resurgence of interest out there. So it's really interesting. So when did things start to change? As I alluded, Social Security shifted who had to live there, because now there were ways, if you were simply destitute, that you might have some support of some sort instead of it coming directly from the county. In 1938, sub-minimum wage authorized the ability to have people work at a less than minimum wage, and that was called 14C. And so a lot of people started to go to workshops and things like this and start to be incorporated into the workforce. Now I'll tell you, some of the work that I've just recently done is around Iowa's 14C rules, because most states don't have that anymore. They were told to, supposedly sunset, but there were still programs operating under a 14C. And so this organization that I work for, ICE, is the Iowa Coalition for Integration and Employment, we worked to get those people transitioned into community employment, real employment, that wasn't protected, segregated, et cetera. So there's still some of that, but that started to change things. And in 1963, the Mental Retardation Facilities and Community Mental Health Centers Construction Act, better known as the Community Mental Health Act, CMHA, was enacted. And that was a big step. Kennedy said, we don't want people in these institutions. People can be taken care of by their communities, et cetera. I mean, it laid the foundation for some wonderful forward thinking that was on the cusp.
I wonder to what extent John F. Kennedy had a sister who had intellectual disabilities.
That's-
and was very quiet about it, and I wondered if, okay, so you got there.
That's exactly right. Kennedy spearheaded the effort to close those, and it was great intentions, but it created a community crisis because none of the communities were prepared for that. We didn't have community mental health centers that could swoop in and help the person. We didn't have available housing. We didn't have staff organized around what does that person need and how are they going to get the medical care, et cetera, that they need. So it was a big false start. But fortunately, it's been picked up again. But that really was not the way it was supposed to go. So I kind of listed here what happened with that. So people who were discharged were turned back into their home communities, typically their counties, and they became a county problem again. And so we started to see a resurgence of persons being readmitted to county care facilities that hadn't happened before. And I'll tell you, most of the people that I knew, I can attest to this personally, with supports, they really didn't need to be there in that setting. but it was the best safety net that counties had at that point. I'm going to back up a couple here because, okay, I mentioned the sub-minimum wage, and that started to change things around. So I talked about the Rehabilitation Act and civil rights and with disabilities, they were added later. The Rehabilitation Act really set things in play. This defined a person with a disability as someone with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities and has a record of such impairment or is regarded to have such an impairment. And this meant that those people were specifically identified through this that they needed support. It took out the destitute people. It took out you're an orphan. It took out all of that. And then the services became laser focused on persons who had a disability of some sort. So I just listed a few of the things that changed legislatively that has had an impact. And probably one of the biggest ones would be in 1983, the Home and Community-Based Services. It was a 1915C waiver, meaning that how the rules and things applied to people who had disabilities and their living circumstances could be changed and dealt with in a different way through this waiver. It was a do your own thing, but there were a lot of rules with it. So, but it took people out of facilities. So the county care facilities started being regulated by the state, Chapter 57. So this speaks to, the bad actors that had been there in some of the facilities, because it called for trained personnel. There had to be a crisis plan. So if you had a fire, if you had something, there was something in place that you were going to do, where were people going to go, et cetera. There were thorough facility inspections. Prior to this, the state would show up and they could make suggestions. And it's kind of like how stop signs work, or speed limit signs work on the interstate. 70 is a great suggestion, but, don't need it. So that was kind of how the rules were implemented previous. But when the state started doing this with meaningful facility inspections, they could levy fines. They could take a facility's license away. They could even file charges if there was gross negligence of some sort. So that was a game changer. And we started keeping medication records, incidents, and we were required to have care review committees. And the care review committee was comprised of citizens who might have an interest in the care facility, who would come and review all the incident reports. They would talk to the clients, to the residents that lived there, and ask them how happy they were and what was going on. And it was the kind of the outside look to get an unvarnished opinion from folks on how things were actually going.
About what year did these changes happen?
Yeah, late 70s, early 80s, because they were in place when I started. But I know that it wasn't way far back when that was not the case. Another big change that happened was we began to have much better luck with pharmaceuticals, medications that could treat mental illness, that could treat epilepsy. There were a number of people that were there when I worked there. Their only reason for being there is they had uncontrolled epilepsy. And again, sad, because that's, there's other ways, so many other ways to be successful in your community without having to be there. So we first started seeing Thorazine and the bipolar disorder medications show up, and that started to really winnow some of the people who had to come to the facility. But the biggest driver to this was that in order to get Social Security in 1935 and going forward, you could not be a person living in any kind of a facility. So if you were in jail, you don't get Social Security. If you were at the care facility, you didn't get Social Security because that's a public facility. an institution. And so people started this big shift. That was the way it was when I was there too, but there were many, I'd call them loopholes that people use to kind of get around the implementation, the stiff implementation of that law. But the big shift started in the 80s because the counties realized if they had Social Security, if they had some of these other supports, the county wouldn't have to pay for medical care. Huge expense. My medical budget was, and it was just huge because the county paid direct self-insuring of those people that went. And once the light went on for counties, they said, we need to get out of this business. We can't be doing facilities. And so I've heard people say, and when Gail talked to me, like, what happened to the care facilities? Where did they go? Well, they really didn't go anywhere. They privatized. And so they might not be known as the Plymouth County Care Facility anymore, but they're known as the Pride Group. That's who they were. And then further along, in 1983, HCBS, the waiver I mentioned, really started to crack down on, we're not going to give any funding of any sort, federal and states won't be able to either easily, if you look in any way, shape, or form like an institution. Even if you're not, if you get that institutional appearance, you're going against the integration concept of people being truly part of their community, being members, et cetera. So that really was the biggest game changer, I think, for people starting to privatize. Mentioned this, there was also a great deal of pressure from advocacy groups. Olmsted, which was a federal case where a person was wrongfully kept in a mental health institution, although there was no reason for her to be there. Things like this. And there were groups like the NAMI, National Association for Mental Illness, ARC, Association of Retarded Citizens. Those people started to coalesce at a ground level and really put some heavy-duty pressure on folks. Further proof that the counties were done with county care facilities, there's an Iowa State Association of Counties, and all county services, the treasurers have their affiliate, the auditors, et cetera. They took out care facilities in 1999. So it was another, the ship has sailed. So what happened then were a lot of the facilities started to consolidate. I'm under here, these 4 facilities listed on the side had a transformation and all became part of Imagine the Possibilities, which is one of the largest providers in the state. And behind that concept was managed care, because it became really clear that being a mom and pop, a smaller person, you didn't have a voice at the table about the coverage and things that people would get and what kind of a payment you would get. So we were seeing a lot of facilities consolidate so that they can negotiate with managed care and actually be a recognized voice instead of being told this is what you're going to do. Other facilities became private facilities. In O'Brien County, they became Village Northwest. They are a lovely, delightful agency, good people, good missions, and they more or less restructured and closed parts of their old county care facility. They may have even torn that down by now, but totally went into the community and offer services there.
Are these private nonprofits or are they for-profit?
They're both. The strong majority are not for profits, but that's starting to change with the consolidations and things like that. To be a for-profit back in when I started was like, if there were providers out there that did that, it's like, what? Why? Why would you do that? But yeah, so there were some other ones. Lynn County became the Penn Center, became the Abbey Center, and now they're owned by Unity Point. So these places didn't go away, they just transformed. Yeah,
You know what the status is of the Madison County home, because I drive past it on the way to Riverside, and it says Madison County Farm, and the building is there.
I don't.
I'm curious.
Yeah, there's some of the ones I don't know what happened. Like Johnson County became a museum. Winnebago County is now a private residence. Somebody has taken that over and has that as their own deal. Dallas County has been taken over by the community college, DMAC, and they do a farming program out of there. So they've taken on all sorts of different missions and purposes, and the people moved into the community. Our facility, we were considered a little outside the dots, but we started to experiment early on with moving people into the community. Not because I had a noble vision, that was not it at all. I'm slightly embarrassed to explain where it came from, but we had a guy who was just horrible. He was so mean and took advantage of all the persons who had developmental disabilities, take their money, take their stuff, push them around. And one day we were talking, it's like, we just wish we could get him out of here, but we didn't have a way to discharge him. So we thought, what if we paid for him to live in an apartment? Because when you do the math, it was cheaper, really, and he didn't need a whole lot of intervention. He needed somebody to give him his meds, make sure he took those. And so we moved him into the no-tell motel area in Nevada, and he set up his place there. And I had staff that on their way to work would go and drop him off his medications, and somebody would check in on him on the way back. And he was the happiest, nicest man on the planet. He hated being at the care facility. So, and that was like the ding, 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 ding for us.
Do you know what he had done? Like, was he an old grumpy farmer, or what had he done?
He was,
I'm related to old grumpy farmers.
yeah. I think he was one of those guys that just would do stuff to end up in jail so that he had a place to be. And so it was really difficult to find a mental illness for him, et cetera. But he ended up there just because he'd been in the system for a long time. So we moved him out. And it worked so well that we started moving everybody out. And the first thing we did was started to rent individual apartments within a complex and move people out. And at this time, we were still Story County, because what we were doing, those were not facilities. Those weren't institutions. They were homes in the community. And so it allowed them access to their Social Security and all the other things, the HCBS funding, et cetera. And so ultimately, we transitioned everyone out of our facility. And that's where the program is today. So we had 77 people, and we moved 74 out at the end, and the program now exists within the community. The program, however, there's my timeline. Story County is a poor farm care facility community. And then the program we did in the community was called Story County Community Life, because we were part of the county system. But then it was privatized because the supervisors that came in really felt like they needed to not be part of the care delivery system. And so now ResCare, which is another large organization, provider organization, has taken that over, but all the buildings are the same, and so on and so forth, and it carries on. So, let's see. Well, the end, but not the end, because the reputation lingers. There are so many. Our facility, the Paranormal Society, asked to come out and get their vibe on all the horrible things that happened, and I know that Boone County had that too, and so I'm guessing that most of the facilities around, after they were not inhabited anymore, that became like, these were insane asylums. They were, torture, etc. They didn't really have anything to report after ours. So, whatever. But I'm sure it made for an interesting night or two that they spent out there. The facility that we had was torn down, and this is the case for a lot of them. You won't find those brick facilities anymore. And typically, the materials were sold. Ours, an Amish organization came and collected all the brick and the ceramic type tiles that were on the roof. They were a terracotta arched tile. And they very carefully took those down, and I assume used them for their building projects. So there was a market for a good deal of this stuff. And in most cases, the farmland has been turned back. The majority of the farmland has been turned back, gotten sold, et cetera. And in fact, that's how Story County financed the move into the community to build a couple of group homes, et cetera, is that they sold the farmable land and just kept a little area where a couple of barns where the secondary roads keeps off-season mowers and grave digging devices out there. So that's kind of what happened. But that's what I can tell you about the development, the trajectory of care facilities. So does anybody have any questions? I realize I'm a minute or two over.
Why do we have homeless people then? Why aren't they being put in the apartments by the county?
Good question. Money. And then how do you regulate that? A lot of people don't want to be in those types of controlled settings, basically because of some of the things that you see that cause persons to be homeless, drug use, et cetera, is difficult to manage. But just my 2 cents, in looking at where we're going right now with how our support systems are being challenged with funding from the government and different views and so on, I've seen everything go around on a merry-go-round here. And I just can't help but think with more supports and community not being able to take care of their own, we may see a resurgence in things like this. They won't look like large institutions because I just don't see anybody getting on that. But I think an organized structure like the care facilities, county homes, I would not be at all surprised to start to see that. That's just my ESP.
Back in the day, I just missed the play-by-play with Social Security. I don't know if you could go back 2 or 3 slides there. So tell me about Social Security changed how they were reimbursing or paying people direct. I didn't quite catch all
Okay.
that. And that had a role to play in the.
Sure.
And let's see back. Yeah, there we go. Somewhere in there. I think maybe the next one. Yeah, there you go. So persons could get Social Security prior to that time. They weren't eligible, or what's the?
Well, before 1935, before Social Security came out, it just didn't exist. When it did, there were clauses that took care of people, provided a way to support people who were indigent, who had other disabilities, and would pay for that. And we would get paid at the county home. We would collect the person's state supplemental assistance, which was given to persons who had disabilities and other things like that. And I don't know, I wasn't the treasurer or the auditor. I don't know how that worked, but that's how everybody did it.
You were like a representative payee, essentially.
Yeah, in a way, yes. That might be a good analogy there. And then that changed even further with them saying you simply can't give this, be in an institution and collect this money.
Okay.
Because the argument was, at that point, that was federal money, and so the federal government was not going to pay for somebody in a institution, because the institution is typically belonged by the state or something, and so that became their problem. So the push with like HCBS really moved people to don't look like a facility, don't look like an institution. And then those dollars that were available to pay providers came out of that. There's matching dollars put in by the states that pays providers for doing their services, and now they're run through managed care. But that's kind of how that turned back in. Did
Social Security can pay then through this a nonprofit, if you will, managed care, but not directly to a state managed. Did I hear that right?
Kinda.
That's okay. You don't have to get into the details. Okay, I'm just curious.
Well, I can talk to you about it a little bit after this if you want, but you're on the right track. And it became who's responsible for funding. If you're in a county institution, then you should be the counties, and so on. And so now the funding that goes through managed care comes down from the feds and is matched by the state. And the state negotiates the contract with the managed care organizations on what their budget is, and the managed care organizations then work out a fee schedule with the state on how much will I get paid per diem as a provider if I have somebody who requires this level of care, and so on. And so it's staggered that way.
Like the Medicaid privatization.
Totally, yeah. Anything else?
I think we had people that maybe came from another county. And so I vaguely remember hearing this, that those other counties then would have to pay.
Exactly, yeah. That became when social services, when the General Relief Department began to morph into something more than just, there's a staff person there who's going to try to help somebody who's in trouble find a spot, into a more organized association with social workers, care provider, coordinators, et cetera. And so they would make those referrals for somebody maybe from another county that, you know, needed a place to be. When we were closing our care facility, that process took about 2 years. I had a gentleman who did not do well with the idea of moving into the community. And so we did a transfer, and he went to live at the Boone County Care Facility for quite a while. And then the Boone County Care Facility moved into the community, and he had to move in anyway. But it wasn't easy for some of the clients. They were the first people I picked to move out into the community, other than the nasty man. I picked the people who were the most successful residents. That this lady, all up and going, would manage, come and get her meds, and she, totally with it. Fell apart in the community setting because it just totally moved her jam. And so that wasn't a good predictor of how you are in one setting, doesn't necessarily predict how successful you're going to be in another. And so we found that some of the people that we thought would be a slam dunk were not. But pretty much everybody made it and still makes it. So, and that's our system today.
On that note, I'm going to pause just so we can stop the live stream. David gets very cranky with me when we go too late.
Sorry, David.
The way that this ties into West Des Moines history is James Jordan was on a Polk County supervisor when the first poor farm in Polk County was started. And I was just looking online. It was in Saylor Township on Northeast 14th. Apparently the sheriff's office is there now. So there's an article on the Des Moines Register archives about it. So if you want to find out more about Polk County poor farms, and I just thought it was very interesting because Polk County supervisors just last week, 2 weeks ago, voted to commit $1 million to feeding people with the SNAP benefits
Yes,
shutting down and
thank
all of that.
God.
So what you were saying about it being a merry-go-round, yeah, what goes around is coming around. So there is no Iowa Files in December, but I hope you consider joining us at our Home for the Holidays event, which is Saturday, December 6th from 1 to 3. The Jordan House is getting all decorated up, and we will also be decorating the Bennett School, and I'll be doing crafts with kiddos in the basement. So thank you so much for joining us today. And again, if anybody wants to know more about becoming a member, come talk to Gail. So thank you very much and have a great day.
Or do you have to?